Welcome to episode 4 of the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this edition, show me the money. There's a lot of oil patch companies that have to deal with slow pay or no pay. And Chris Simeniuk of PayScore.ca talks about working and how to make sure that you see your green in your pocket. Good afternoon. Welcome to episode 4 of the Pipeline Online Podcast. And I've got my co-host here, Bronwyn, Eyre.
Hi, Brian.
And we are going to have Chris Simeniuk of PayScore.ca. And Chris first talked to me almost 2 years ago and kind of bird dogged me about, hey, we should do a story on this. And I dragged my heels, and I apologize for that. But I think this is a really good chance to talk in depth about one of the issues that I first came aware of about almost 15 years ago now. Slow pay and no pay. Companies, particularly oil companies, who drag their heels in paying their vendors, the companies that work for them, people actually working in the field. So I'd like to introduce Chris Simeniuk. And Chris, you're up.
Hey, Brian. Hi, Bronwyn. Thanks for having me today. Where do you want to start?
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up doing PayScore.
Oh, long and short of it, based out of Alex, Alberta right now, originally from Saskatchewan. The PayScore thing came about because being a contractor ourselves, there were no tools out there that were relevant to our industry that told us as a service company if the clients we're working for were paying reliably.
Ron, when you did a little bit of work in as AG there regarding slow pay and prompt pay, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was the prompt payment legislation, and it was slightly before my time in justice. But Chris would like to get your thoughts on that. I mean, obviously, Saskatchewan legislation 2022, I believe, whole point was to enable prompter payment. There are some exemptions within the mining sector, power generation projects, is my understanding, and between architects and engineers. So these quite niche exemption areas. But since the prompt payment legislation came in, I guess thoughts on its effectiveness from your perspective in the province here in Saskatchewan.
Well, I can't speak to the Saskatchewan side, but they came out with similar in Alberta here in August, rolled out August of 2022. And it focused on construction, and oil and gas was kind of rode out of it. There's an exemption there. But there's a gray area. If it's construction-based oil and gas, then it's still supposed to fall in. And the legislation said that contractors were supposed to get paid within 28 days of invoice, and then subs 7 days after. And a lot of the industry went, hooray, this will be a silver bullet. What I'm hearing anecdotally from folks, though, is the legislation's there, but it didn't do much to change behavior of a lot of the companies. And to that point, it actually went backwards, where there's an arbitration. I'm probably using the wrong term here. There's an arbitration part where if you don't get paid in 28 days as a contractor, you can go to this arbitration and get it dealt with. Well, what I'm hearing from the background is companies, the general contractors and some of the project owners are writing that into their contracts that you will forego this. That's one thing I'm hearing. The other thing I'm hearing is there's even more of a fear factor for the contractors to use this clause, because for example, if I'm the contractor and you're the project owner and I want to take you to arbitration, it's a public stage.
Right.
So it's a public execution. So for the general contractors, project owners, you can pick out who your squeaky wheels are, blacklist them, never have it again, and make everybody fall in line. So I don't really think the legislation, without something on the front end to measure whether it's working or not, really does much other than drives this issue of slow pay, no pay further underground.
Right. So I want to hear from listeners. Sorry, Brian, about the Saskatchewan.
Go ahead, Bronwyn.
Yeah, no, it just would be interesting to hear from our Saskatchewan listeners about exactly what you've said, Chris, and how, whether that's now something they're seeing similarly in Saskatchewan, the way the prompt payment legislation fallout has happened. So that'll be interesting to hear from people.
So, and Bronwyn just alluded to here is that if you are watching live right now on X or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, any comments you make under this will appear on our screen, and we can choose to interact with them if they're constructive. If you think I need a haircut or something like that, we'll maybe leave that off. But yeah, so please do contribute. If you have short little snippets or stories or stuff you'd like to incorporate into the conversation, please do. I do want to get into here how I first learned about slow pay and no pay. So back when I was doing Pipeline News for 12 years, I did a few focuses that were on accounting and about revenue. And one of the things I discovered is that there are a lot of oil companies, and this is even back when before the boom ended, that take their time in paying their bills, paying their contractors. So when I say vendor, I mean like the service rig company and the vac truck and the even some of the people who do their contracting, like field operators, that sort of thing. But I mean, the people that are working for the oil company, you have to provide most of the real work in the field. The broader public thinks that the oil patch is the oil companies doing most of it. It's actually not. It's the companies that work for them, the vendors. So this is a scenario that was given to me, and it's actually can be very accurate, especially since right now we're second month of January, or sorry, second month of the winter, I guess. Let's say, for instance, you have a vac truck and you're called out to go do something on January 2nd. Well, what can happen? Sorry about that. Is that you can go out, go do the job on January 2nd, wrap it up, and then you have to pay your staff every 2 weeks. So you're paying your staff, you're paying for your fuel, you're paying for your motor vehicle insurance, you're paying for your operational staff and everything. They all get paid by, January 20th or whatever for work up to the January 14th. You don't get to send your invoice in. A lot of these companies won't take their invoices until like the last week of the month. And then what happens is that, that invoice has to be approved by the consultant for the project, and they might accidentally forget to put their sticker on it, their AFE, their authorized funds expenditure, or they may end up losing it, or it might end up getting shuffled in the pile, and it doesn't get processed until instead of end of January, now end of February, and then miraculously for something found wrong on it, and there might be one line item on your invoice that isn't perfect to whatever their accounting standards is, and then it gets bounced back to you, and finally doesn't get approved until now we're looking at the end of March. Well, then the company will often take up to 90 days to pay, not from January 2nd, not from January 23rd when the invoice was submitted, but March 23rd when the invoice was approved. So now you're looking April, May. They might not get the funds in their account until late June for work that was done on January 2nd. Now, I've discussed this scenario with numerous people, dozens of people in the patch who've all told me, yes, that absolutely happens. And some companies are much worse than others. And if you're launching an oil field service business, you better be prepared to run 6 months with no money coming in and paying out all your expenditures for 6 months before you have a regular cash flow. This is not uncommon. So, Chris, can you talk about that scenario? Am I full of it, or have you heard of these things?
No, you're right in there. I mean, the number of companies that take over 90 days to pay has, in our last year of collecting data, has gone from 16% to 22% of companies that are reported on. So it's increasing. And the slow pay has big implications. It erodes your bottom line. I mean, if you're running a line of credit, that's into that profit margin. The secondary thing is, if your accounts age past 90 days, a lender will look at that no longer as an asset, but that they can call that in off your line of credit. So to your point, where if you are a service company writing out those really long invoices, if your bank catches wind they can essentially claw that in. And I had that conversation with several service companies last spring during breakup, where went to work all winter and came home more broke than what they went out. And they were still sitting there waiting for 120 days to be paid, and their lenders were calling in their lines of credit. Like,
And
not a story I'm making up. I mean, that's like that sucks. You went out working all winter, and the bank is saying you're done.
Well, and what really bothered me about that is, and some people pointed this out, is that certain companies, I won't list names here, companies who had literally billions of dollars in revenue, in cash flow, they were effectively running on your line of credit, because you were the one, as you just said, who are paid out all that stuff, and they're, instead of it coming out of their pocket and they're covering interest on a line of credit, they're doing it on your line of credit as the vendor. And I'm talking big companies that employed a lot of service companies, and this would be a regular thing, and it would stretch it out often, like say 90 days or 80 days. I think it's honestly, well, I'll get more into that, but Bronwyn, maybe you want to jump in here.
Well, I just find it intriguing, Chris. I mean, I think you're basically saying, and I know more from on the Alberta side, but that the prompt payment legislation is not working on the ground the way it was envisaged. I mean, and you mentioned blacklisting of companies, editing the alternative dispute resolution part of the process out of the contracts. How would you fix this? How would you fix the process to make it actually be a prompt payment process?
Well, I think it's got to be measured, and my comments were around the construction side, because again, most of the oil and gas stuff was wrote out of it. So what I'm hearing on the construction side is, second hand, third hand, so it's fairly anecdotal. But unless it's measured, and the reason companies can get away with it is there's complete lack of transparency. The frontline vendors are always last to be paid, first to be shorted, and there's no central network amongst them, so they're very fragmented. It's very easy to pick them off one by one, and give each one a it's in the mail, or it's an accounting glitch, or whatever excuse, and they're none the wiser. And you can tell this to your entire supply chain. And the next thing is there's nothing to measure it. There's no measuring stick of how good's good, how bad's bad. And then for the leaders, there's no incentivization on the good payers, and there's no penalties for the laggards. So, I mean, you end up, if you're a nerd like me and you love Venn diagrams, you end up with three perfect circles that intersect, and you end up with a very dark area that I don't know if you want to call them bad actors, the right word, but say ruthless businesses can use their supply chain like, credit cards, and burn through them one by one.
Is that this one you're talking about?
That one there, you betcha, Brian. So right in the middle, and whether that taking it into oil and gas context, whether that producer has mature fields that just aren't financially viable, or or whatever other reason, it in that dark area, they can get away with it, and nobody knows why.
So those circles, for people who can't see it, are lack of incentive, lack of network, and lack of measurement, which all adds up to slow pay or no pay. Now, one of the things that really struck me on this sort of thing was, it really reminds me of an abusive relationship of a woman who's been married to a man who beats her senseless every few months and is hiding the bruises. And oops, I fell down the stairs. And she feels she cannot leave that relationship. And I think that a lot of oil field service companies, if you're a vac truck company, can you go find work in agriculture? Not really. If you're a service rig company, there are no other options, and there's only maybe a dozen different oil companies to work for. And if the one that you are working for is treating you like this, do you leave and hope you can find something else and walk away from the work you have? So I really do feel like the slow pay and eventually no pay, we'll get into that in a second, I really do feel it is analogous to a battered wife. What do you think, Chris?
You're not the first person to make that that comparison. I hear that several times, and even on the leaders of the industry, it's like, well, I pay my bills. I know my neighbor has this bad behavior, but as long as I'm good, it doesn't matter. And this is where this topic is such a taboo. People don't want to speak about it out in the open because there's such a fear of reprisal, which feeds into that, the tick boxes, if you will, of what makes an abusive relationship. Well, there you go. If you're scared to say anything on social media or this or that or the other about a company because they're going to blacklist you, well, that's that's a complete lack of transparency and integrity and honesty on that company's actions in my part.
So, Bronwyn, you want to go here before I get into my example?
Yeah, well, just to point out, the construction context is also the context of the Saskatchewan legislation. So the dispute resolution is overseen in this province by the Saskatchewan Construction Dispute Resolution umbrella, right? So probably pretty similar. It would be really interesting to hear from listeners about how that's carried over into the oil and gas sector in the province. I guess two quick questions, Chris, on this then. One is, has there been any formal discussion with the Alberta government about, prompt payment legislation now a few years in, formally or informally? Are they aware of some of these concerns? And I guess my second question is just on the contract itself. And I know this was something that I heard occasionally around the prompt payment legislation. It would be, prompt payment legislation only offers so much protection. It really comes down in the end to the contract that two parties or more, contractors and subcontractors kind of enter into with each other, and you can pretty much cover off anything in a contract. So I guess just whether you think that's being done enough, or whether people are relying on the current system maybe too much.
Yeah. So your first part, I have had conversations with folks from Alberta government, and they reached out to me. It was the conversation was stirred up by service companies that were knocking on their door saying, "Hey, why doesn't this legislation apply to us? We've got a problem. What do we do?" And I got brought into the conversation there just as, what are you seeing? Because apparently you're the outfit that's measuring this. So I give my feedback and my anecdotal stories that I've heard from contractors, and same thing. Well, how do we fix this? I said, well, you need a way to measure it on the front end, but it needs to be able to protect those people that are providing that information. Because again, they will just drive the problem underground because that fear of getting thrown on the blacklist.
Mm-hmm.
The contracts, that knife cuts both directions. I feel that's an area where contractors, the smaller they are, the more they fall down in that area because they don't think to redline that or bring that up for negotiation. They just accept the terms for what they are.
Yeah.
Or they don't read them all together.
Yeah.
And you know what? If you're not reading your contracts, that's on you. You can't blame the party that threw the contract out you if you didn't read it and you simply signed it. You got to take that one on the chin. That's your own doing. But as far as it getting wrote out, I haven't seen it. I haven't had to deal with it. Again, I'm only hearing stories that it's happened.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about as far as I can talk on it. But if it is happening, that's pretty sketchy ground to be on, because I can't go write out health and safety requirements out of the contract, and that's right. A legislation. So
yeah.
So I wanted to get into an example here of how a person can fall into what was originally a good business relationship to a slow pay to eventually no pay one. So this is a real example, happened to me. So I launched Pipeline Online 3 years ago, and in October of 21, and one of my first clients was Royal Helium, and they were, I felt a lot of affinity to them because they helped me get off the ground. They were one of my first people. They were paying their bills on time. At one point, they were about a quarter of my revenue for the first few months. Thus, I felt a lot of loyalty to them. Well, this showed up in the mail last week. This is from a law firm, and it said, in the matter of notice of intention to make a proposal of Royal Helium in the City of Toronto under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. So what had happened was that Royal, being an explorer, and they found helium, and then they built a helium processing facility in Alberta. They were not successful in making a go of it. Their revenues were not where they needed to be, and they eventually have become insolvent. Now, I was advertising an ad on my website. Now, thankfully, an ad on my website, I'm not paying for staff. I'm not paying for diesel or anything like that. Yes, it takes out of the amount of ad slots I can have, but I'm not putting out actual expenditures for that once it's already done. And they had a consistent ad running for a long time, and then the checks started coming later and later. Next thing you know, they were a month behind, and then they were 3 months behind, and then I would send a statement and saying, I understand you're in a tough spot, and you're waiting for your revenue to come in. I believe in you. I actually said that, and I did, and in some ways I still do, but I said, I have faith in you. You had faith in me. If you can send anything, send 1 month's payment, that would help. So they did that a couple times. So I got a couple more checks out of them, but eventually, I ended up extending them a whole year, and I did not get paid for that year's worth of advertising. Did it hurt me? Not really, in that I can always use that as a write-off, but it was definitely an object lesson to eventually get this notice here and seeing my company listed on the creditor list. And, I think that this is one of the reasons I really wanted you on here, Chris, is because, some would say I wasn't hard-nosed enough, and maybe I wasn't. And the other thing is that I know advertising is the first thing to get cut for anything. And I understand that too. So I don't want to push too hard, because it's easy to get cut off, and it's much easier to get someone who might come back on as a paying thing than to lose them entirely. It's always easier to keep a customer than it is to find a new one. And Chris, I wanted your perspective on, maybe I fell into some traps there. I mean, do you see this sort of thing happening with other people, with oil companies who are taking their time and all of a sudden they're not, this sort of pattern? Can you explain that at all?
Yeah, and it's evolving quickly. From the time we started this thing, like taking it back a step, the reason PayScore started, or what kicked us in the butt to make it happen, is we went through a slow pace. Well, several, but I mean, the one that sticks out is one we were months behind trying to pay our guys. Leah was at home. It was middle of winter. She's plowing snow, shipping grain, trying to just pay her staff, make payroll here off the farm, which, my farm shouldn't be subsidizing an oil company. Anyhow, we got through it, got paid. It was an accounting glitch. And again, why does my business and all other service companies have to suffer because of your computer system changeover? That doesn't fly in my mind. But right after that, friends of ours went through the same scenario, same warning sign, same that we did. And at the end of the day, the company they're working for went bankrupt. And people say, well, you should know, everybody knows their customers, or you hear around town. Well, the trouble was, the company that went under was a really good company in the area. Good rates, paid timely, good to work for. They were good until they weren't. And then it was a surprise. But again, it got drug on for months because, it's a glitch, it's this, it's that, the other, excuses. And every vendor that was dealing with it at the time had their blinders on, thinking this is just a me problem. We'll get through this, and like you, Brian, we'll come out the other side and maintain a relationship with the customer. When the smoke cleared on that particular insolvency, being a small area, all the vendors kind of sat around the table afterwards, proverbially, and tearing their beer. And, you were getting burned. You cut them off 3 months ago. Well, 3 months ago, they told me to put an extra truck on because they loved me so much and felt bad about my glitch. The only reason I got to put extra trucks on is because you took yours out. Like, it just, when it all shook out, everybody looked at each other and went, man, if we could have just shared that information 8 months, 6 months sooner, we would have known we're not a glitch, and we could have just went nope. And it wouldn't have stopped that producer from going insolvent, but they wouldn't have taken half the countryside with them. And that's when that happened. It was newsworthy. It was the same year we had Trident went under, Sequoia went under, both made news pretty heavy, around $20 million a piece. Now we're seeing insolvencies like Alphabo hit 73 million. Long Run was over 50 million. Like we're seeing the size for a similar footprint or even smaller footprints field wise, the size of the creditor lists are getting way bigger. And to me, that's just telling me the temptation to use the supply chain as a credit card is just too good to pass up.
You're on mute, Brian.
Sorry about that. Still getting over this cough. Folks, we're going to go to an ad here for a second, and please do put some comments on here. We got over 40 people watching live right now, 33 on X and 8 on Facebook. Any comments you put on here will show up, and we can respond if you've had any experiences like this or any thoughts. And after the break, we're going to get Chris to explain how PayScore works and its genesis. So let's hold on for 30 seconds. There's a reason that HG Jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grimes Sales and Service, Batman, Saskatchewan. And we're back here, and I do have a comment from Doug Thompson, who's a good friend of mine. So Douglas says, I can recall having to wait 90 days to get paid. I had to sit down with my wife and borrow money to pay the company's bills. Thank goodness my wife was working as a nurse. I've heard countless stories like this. How about small oil companies that contract service companies and explain that they are in trouble and request a 50% discount or else they'll be going into receivership. Fast forward a few months and record record profits.
You want my unfiltered feedback on that?
Hey, we're as brutal as we need to be here.
After hearing similar to these, I don't know how many times over the last 3 years, if you want to be a bank, then be a bank. Then you own being a bank. Don't snivel when you get burned. That's my unfiltered, don't complain when they take your money and run away. As a service company, you're a stakeholder. You're not a shareholder. If you're going to put that rate out there to help keep them afloat, and they say, oh yeah, if we stay afloat, I'll pay you double. Well, now I'm an investor. I'm a shareholder, not a stakeholder. And as a service company, I've never once heard where, lots of times we'll get slow paid or no paid, but never will get overpaid because, we did extra good. So here's some extra money. So no, if you're an oil company or even a service company, I don't care what company, if you are short of money, go to your investors. Your supply chain are not your investors. And just pushing the bad debt further and further down the food chain, no, that doesn't help the situation.
How would PayScore, Chris, and Brian had referenced to how it sort of works. How would PayScore address that situation that we just heard come in on text or Brian's example of Royal Helium? Just kind of the nuts and bolts of where you come in.
Yeah, fair. So going back to the previous insolvencies, where this came about was when we sat back and went, geez, we got out of it. We watched friends of ours didn't come out the other side. Like we really can't afford to have one of those again. And when we looked at existing tools to risk-proof ourselves and be proactive, there's nothing there. The existing credit checks, they're expensive. The information in them wasn't relevant because I haven't met, even doing what we're doing, I've talked to 2 service companies out of hundreds that actually report to credit bureaus. And it was very sporadic reporting. So if your industry peers aren't reporting, what good is the information? And what we found was the traditional credit checks look at everything really up close to that building front, as using the oil companies as context, phone bills, power bills, vehicle lease, building lease, things of this nature. service companies are still at the end of the food chain where they're last to be paid, first to be shorted. So like we took a look at it, and be further down, Brian. There you go. So right there, I use this diagram to show just the order of how the different stakeholder buckets get paid. And this circled area is where the traditional credit risk is monitored. We're down at the far end. So when we kind of connect these dots, we looked at it from a health and safety point of view that, preventing physical injury, why don't we look at it preventing financial injuries the same way? And you don't search out the tripping hazards via, from the 30th floor of the Calgary office tower. We know that lagging indicators in health and safety don't work. So we went leading indicator. You do it from boots on the ground. What are you truly actually seeing? So we built a platform where vendors rate the companies on how long they're taking to pay them. That way, back to the original statement, if a producer is starting to get slow pay or erratic pay, at least service companies can spot those tripping hazards and share those financial tripping hazards with their peers. How you manage risk at that stage, well, that's up to you as a business to decide.
So in 2024, and I know this was from information you had given us as well, so producer insolvency values broke records, creditor values were nearly double the previous year on record, which was 2019. So given that, tell us about how that relates, I guess, to payment and really to your world, in terms of what you're going to be seeing out there, you think?
Well, whether that's a COVID catch up, there's been some of that argument that we're playing catch up on that wave. The mechanism's hard to say. I mean, gas prices have been way down. Natural gas price and our shallow gas producers are really taking a hit there. So it's where the market's going. It's hard to tell. You need a crystal ball. But looking at 229 million of bad debt last year, being nearly double, like we're on a hockey stick curve. And compare that to the previous 4 years combined, we're only 190 million. It's huge money.
Yes, I pulled up your slide here showing 24 insolvencies between 4 years, and last year 13 insolvencies. So that's those are some pretty big numbers.
Yeah, and what concerns me most, Brian, when I look at them is just the size of the creditor amounts on each one. Going back to when we thought there were massive ones with Sequoia and Trident that were hitting the news at 20 million, we'll say a piece. Now we're seeing, 35, 56, well, in the 50s, 70, 74 million for Alphabo. And yeah, getting larger and larger. And there's other issues that play into that, like the anti-oil, trying to push banks to not finance oil and gas, whether that's part of it, and other things feeding into that. But especially for the junior producers, getting access to investments getting harder and harder.
Well, and Bronwyn here, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, because as minister, you ended up catching the orphan wells. And, when these things happen, when you're talking about, Chris, you're talking about canary in a coal mine being the service companies not getting paid. Mm-hmm. And then when they're not getting paid and they go insolvent, and then all of a sudden it lands on the orphan well fund. Bronwyn, can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
Well, and I was going to ask Chris, I mean, obviously, we saw it all in terms of, the last 10 years, really. I mean, from kind of boom to bust, and we talked about COVID, to how do we deal with that? I mean, in the COVID time, that's when the federal abandonment program came in, which we felt in Saskatchewan was really an economic program. I mean, it was a make work necessity program, and I think went very well. And one of the things I was going to ask you about is coming out of those programs, each province did somewhat different things, mainly Alberta and Saskatchewan, of course, but, to try to involve more and more service companies, broaden the reach, and involve, medium, small players, which maybe weren't part of contracts with the bigger companies before, and so on. I was going to ask you about how you felt that those programs, which were kind of economic, as I say, impetus programs, worked, particularly in the context of maybe some of the trickle down, which wasn't so positive from the top down, from the bigger companies down to the service level.
Those programs for the abandonments, so those were good. Those did keep people working in some really odd economic times. So, and had the double benefit of cleaning up some liabilities and getting those off the books. To that, but that's still an ongoing thing, because as we have companies get further and further behind, like our Rural Municipality Association, you start tagging them as zombie companies. So I've kind of been feeding off that phrase. But as these zombie companies are allowed to drag on, they just keep piling this stuff up. And where Saskatchewan sits with their regulatory would be similar to where AER sits. And when we look at these insolvencies, it's always the same four stakeholders up front first. So you got your vendors, service companies see slow pay, no pay first. Then it's municipal taxes. Then it's your landowner leases. And in mixed around there, or in about the fourth domino, if you will, are your joint venture partner companies, other producers that are tied in with them. And then the regulators kind of in behind that. And usually once it hits that, it's a crash and burn.
I've got a comment here from Douglas again, and I think this is definitely part of this, is the having third-party invoicing. I remember when Open Invoice came in, and everyone, all the bigger oil companies said, well, you had to do your invoicing through this, and that caused a lot of headache for a lot of service providers. Just read what Douglas says here. Anyone recall Cortex, where oil companies were offered a free service to help manage their payment services to service companies? Many oil companies thought this was a great idea and the opportunity to save money. Oil companies made invoicing through these third parties a requirement. How do these third-party payment companies make their money? They charge the end user to process the invoices. So it used to be you got an invoice from your service company. You'd send it, say, to Crescent Point, and then Crescent Point paid you, because that's the way business always worked. Well, then they brought in these third-party things where you have to sign up for their service, and you have to basically recreate your entire invoicing system to fit their thing, and you're the one paying for it. What are your thoughts, Chris?
They're starting to rationalize some of those, but there's others popping up. And I heard there were 6 or 8 of these platforms out there, and different companies used them. So if you're a vendor, you had to be on as many of these things as you were some of the safety databases. And the complaint I heard from people, especially ones that had more gray hair than me, it's like, well, how the hell did we get an invoice paid net 30 back in 1982 when I had to send it in by the Pony Express through the mail, and I got paid faster then than I can with all this Dropbox stuff? Like, why? We're just adding layers of complication. It's not making the system any better.
So, Chris, if I'm an oil field company, I'm in the media, but let's say I'm a service rig company, and I want to, take advantage of your system. How do I join PayScore? What are you, a membership, or are you a service? What do I do? What do I get? Give me your pitch.
It's we put a lot of effort into making it simple, because we knew our user base was going to be, everything from the owner operator that's trying to drive the truck, grease the truck, fix the truck, and do books at night on the kitchen table, or, the wife's doing the books. So we kept it as streamlined as we could with those folks in mind, having, worn that hat. So it's an annual subscription. You sign up on our website, PayScore.ca, hit sign up, put your company particulars in, put your credit card in, you get your subscription. Once you're in there, you have a dashboard you populate with the companies you work for. So say you work for 10 different producers. It'll take you 10 minutes to set up your initial dashboard, put your ratings in, and now your dashboard becomes a living, running credit check for the companies you work for. Plus you get to look up any others that are in the database.
So going forward, Chris, and I know, again, you've commented on some of the economics, coming out of COVID and the uncertain times that we find ourselves in now, and no big surprise in this sector. It's always up and down, but, highest expected level of drilling activity we've seen forecasted in a while, but at the same time, all this stuff about tariffs and obviously great uncertainty in that regard, including for the energy sector. Where do you see this going? And I know none of us has a crystal ball, but specifically as it impacts, again, your world and the solidity of companies and their ability to pay other companies.
I've been using the comparison to like an Indiana Jones or a Laura Croft movie, where you get the tunnel with all the booby traps and there's gold at the end of it. That's the way I'm looking at things. Like there's gold at the end of the tunnel if you can get to it, but if you make one misstep, it's going to hurt real bad. And take the bump in activity. Well, that's great. That'd be nice to see. But on the same side of that, I see these zombie companies going, "Hey, we're just one of the guys out here busy too. We're just giving her like everybody else. Come on, work for us," and bring a bunch of service companies on to do a workover program or drilling program, whatever it may be, and fund it off the back of the service companies. Try to turn the corner and still not be able to crawl out.
So Douglas has a question here in regards, and I was thinking this thing myself regarding being anonymous. So I go on there, I create my list of 10 companies I'm working for, and I give each of them a thing. Can those oil companies, either directly or indirectly, find out that I'm giving them a crappy score?
Nope. We've made a point of protecting the front end users, and when we first launched, there was one report you could pull in there. We still have that report, but you could pull a detailed report that showed all the ratings on the oil company and who left them. And we thought, well, if we're promoting transparency, what's good for the goose, good for the gander. And we ran it like that for 2 years. Nobody had any blowback. There was never any issue with it. The reason we anonymized it was we actually had producers reach out and ask us to do that. And I said, well, why? We would like to see more people on the platform because the same laggards that are hurting the service companies are hurting us in our group too, but we can't do nothing about it. And the service companies are the ones that need to be encouraged to step forward and have a safe space to do this.
Can oil companies appeal the ratings?
Nope, not at this stage. So we are working on an initiative we're calling PayScore Select, where producers can have access to the system and not see users. They can have the same dashboard, but they can get on to monitor themselves if they maintain over a certain score. And as part of that, if they get a missed payment rating, say somebody slags them, just an anomaly comes in, they will have the opportunity to appeal that, but not if they're not part of this initiative.
Can someone come in and basically get their buddy who's everyone knows someone who owns a service company or whatever, to go in and game the system to slag their competitor?
Not easily, no, because it's a pay to play system.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to throw good money out there to get on the system to do that. Second thing is, on our dashboard, you can only put one rating per company every 28 days. We made that timeline to match the prompt pay. We did that.
Do you encourage them to do that every month?
Pardon me?
How often do you encourage people to update their scores?
Up every month if they can, as often as possible, because it keeps it fresh in the system. But the reason for that, where it locks out entering your score for 28 days, is so that you can't have, it's a bumper guard, so you can't have somebody get in there and give them 100 attaboys, or I'm mad at them and throw 100 rocks.
Gotcha. So we had this slide here on the deck. You want to talk a little bit about that?
This slide?
Yeah.
Well, this is back to that other diagram where we talked about lack of network, lack of measurement, lack of incentivization, that dark area. Where that was a dark area where the bad actors could go wild, with PayScore, we now have a discrete network between service companies. So solves that box. We have a standard simplified measurement of how long do these companies take to pay their bills. So now we've got a measuring stick. Incentivize and manage. Well, now if a company is a good payer, why not promote that That's a very undersold trait in my eyes these days, when the oil patch is trying to find any means to boost its image. Combine those three, back to the Venn diagram, what was a dark spot is now illuminated and removes that issue.
One of the things that I was involved with is when COVID hit, my job of Pipeline News disappeared. And I was asked by the Premier's office to do some short-term consulting about, what can we do and how can we help? And one of the things that I was asked to do was call everyone I know and ask them, how are you doing? And how can we help? And this was when the accelerated well closure program was being envisioned. And I was specifically asked, what do people want in this program? And my biggest recommendation is that whatever you do, that you have to pay in 30 days because we're in a crisis. COVID is, wiping out everyone's revenue. If you're going to take 90 days to pay, you might as well not even do the program. You have to do it in 30 days. And Bronwyn, I believe that did happen. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I'm almost positive it did. I know that we paid a lot of attention to that, given the times and given just the importance of that, and really got, very good reviews about the rollout. In the first, second, and I believe there were 3 or 4 other stages. So yes, and that was a big important part of that.
We still have time here for a few more minutes, folks. If anyone else wants to make a comment or ask Chris a question. Chris, is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
Well, to your comments on slow pay and that 30, 90-day thing, that is, in my eyes, that is where it allows these insolvencies to get ahead of themselves or get too big. Because if we're net 30, we can spot a deviation. Net 30 is a standard in the industry. We can spot a deviation so much sooner. If the whole industry is net 90, well, when are they slow pay, or when's the start of an insolvency, or the signs of an insolvency? Because at 120 days, well, you missed the cutoff, Brian, getting your invoice in, and it can quickly grow to months and months of invoices piled up when a producer finally shuts its doors. So it's the slow pay and no pay are so tied together in my eyes.
I just find, with the prompt payment legislation, I know there have been a number of RMs which have expressed some concerns about, the exemptions, which I touched on earlier, but also about how it's still a work in progress, getting to a point where there really is prompt payment, as there should be. And obviously that's what we've been talking about here. I'm a bit surprised, I guess, that there has, it just seems to me that this is certainly something that the government, of Saskatchewan should be aware of. I'm glad there have been some discussions with the government of Alberta. I know that with prompt payment legislation, there was a consultation period, so-called, governments love consultation periods, after the legislation was brought in. How's it working? How's it not working? Anyone have any concerns? I guess I would urge the, the oil and gas sector, the supply side companies, supply chain, to connect with the Ministry of Energy and say, there are still issues, and there are private sector operators, and such as you, Chris, who have had to step in to fix things and to really address remnant issues. And it just sort of surprises me that maybe has not happened to the extent that it should have. That they should be hearing about that or seeking that information out. More a comment than a question.
Yeah, I don't know why they're not getting that information. I feel part of it is going to the right parties to get that feedback. Using construction as an example, going to a construction association that is 50% developers, general contractors, and 50% subcontractors, and asking in an open forum and expecting the little guys to speak freely, you're really not going to get the right answer. And that's what the government needs to do if they do want to step in on this issue, is they need to go to the frontline people that are scared to speak, out in public.
Yeah, that's the thing that's really jumped out at me among the most from this conversation is, this zombie company reality, that there are as many of them as there still appear to be. And we've known them for, you know, there are some infamous examples, but clearly there are too many. And then this not maybe code of silence so much, but issue around speaking out, which is understandable, right? Which you and Brian have both raised. And I think you're right. I think there has to be a kind of a proactive seeking those people out, because they're not going to say it in a more public forum for all kinds of reasons. So that's really unfortunate. That disconnect has to be solved, seems to me.
It absolutely reinforces the battered wife syndrome thing. No one talks about it. Doesn't exist. Those bruises, they didn't happen. Douglas has a comment here, and Douglas has been a company man for a couple oil companies, so he's been the guy who signs off on some of this stuff. He says, I've processed many contracts for oil companies, and it isn't unusual for some people to have fast pay in terms of 7 days from the date of invoice. It's not common, but these types of contracts exist for special circumstances. And I actually had this for one oil company I did some photography for, where they actually put into their terms that if we pay you within 10 days, we get to take 2% off the top. I honestly, I don't think it's fair for anyone to say we're not going to pay you the full amount of what your invoice, but that was their policy. To pay you in a reasonable time, we get to give ourselves a discount. Chris, what do you think?
I've spent words out here. I've heard there are quite a few companies that offer prompt pay. I guess if that's what you accept, that's what you accept. I mean, there's a difference though. If I agree to net 30 and you're going to pay me net 30 and you're a reliable net 30 payer, cool. If you're offering me a discount for net 10, if I want to take it, I'll take it. If I don't, I don't. For me, a 30-day pay is pretty good. The one that really grinds my teeth that I hear from vendors are, say they're net 30 or supposed to be net 30. Well, now it's day 60, day 90, still haven't been paid, and then get told by who they're dealing with that, well, you know, we're a little short of cash, but we can probably cut you a check if you're willing to negotiate down a bit. That to me is dirty pool.
So Chris here, I wanted to ask you before we wrap up, what's your presence in Saskatchewan right now, and what do you need for a critical mass to make something like this effective in Saskatchewan, being that we are 10% the size of Alberta's oil patch? Yeah,
we're down in your corner. We're not, we don't have much of a footprint there. Kindersley area, we've got a few around there. Yeah, so definitely like to grow this out in Saskatchewan and help folks out there. I mean, that's where my roots come from. So I got a soft spot in my heart for that area. You know, it's funny, as few as 20 people when we launched can make a huge difference on starting to collect a picture, because most people only get 3 people on a credit app. So if you get even 20 service companies in a region reporting, the information grows so quickly and keeps it's such an expanded view and network over, you know, a couple sales guys BSing at a coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chris, you want to tell us a little bit about your coupon code?
Well, we'll to kick that in gear in Saskatchewan, if folks want to give us a try, reach out to me. I can give you a demo, show you what it's about, so it's not a surprise. You're not opening an unknown box. But you know, to help Brian out in awareness on his platform here, we'll do a 60% discount off our subscription. Coupon code is the word pipeline, and we'll kick out the first 20 subscriptions into Saskatchewan. We'll knock 66% off for those folks.
So that's the first time I've done anything like this before, but you know, this is a service I think that we definitely need. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't. It's very difficult as you're talking about, you know, the coffee shop stuff, to translate the coffee shop scuttlebutt into something that's actionable. That, you know, hey, maybe by talking to my competitors, instead of all of us getting, you know, screwed on this, maybe we can avoid, you know, a real bad week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you look at a lot of service companies are what, 10% margin these days. We haven't seen our rates go up since 2014, but our expenses have, right? So there was 1,500 service companies, over 1,500 service companies are tied up in those insolvencies last year. And those are just the public numbers, not the ones that happened to zombie companies and behind the scenes. the average hit's 60 grand a piece. Well, that means that if I get a hit, and 1,500 service companies, that's close to a 1 in 3, 1 in 4 odds of getting hit. I'd have to do 600,000 of new work for the fun of it, just to cover the costs on that job. So yeah, it's due diligence in these days going forward, to me, is critical, whether that's our system or something else. But running blind is gonna hurt real bad.
Do you have any competitors in this space?
Not directly, no. I mean, you got your Equifax type systems, but again, they're credit bureau based, and they don't capture those frontline vendors that are, the canary in the coal mine, the ones that are truly exposed. So we needed something that was a peer-to-peer on the front line as far out as we could, because we in last paid for shorted. There's nobody further down the line to warn us. We got to do it ourselves. This is a vendor problem. Vendors got to fix it themselves. Nobody's coming to our rescue. So
Bronwyn, if you want to wrap up your end here.
No, I just want to thank you so much, Chris, for coming on. Really interesting, and I think absolutely necessary in Saskatchewan. It's interesting. There's the gap that there's been in this area. So thanks for what you do, and lovely to have you on. And thanks to, was it Doug Bryan who texted us so many questions?
Yep, Douglas Thompson, Saskatoon. He started out on drilling rigs in the North Sea, and he worked his way from a roughneck to a company man, and now he instructs people on the safe operation of what he called well control. He's an international expert, works overseas in that regard.
Excellent. Well,
so, Douglas, maybe you might be one of our guests here coming up soon. Anyhow, that's all we have for today. Thank you very much. We are working on other shows coming up over the next couple months here. I've been talking to the CEO of Saturn. I'm going to get him on one of these days. I have a story came out today on Saturn's growth plans, but also the story for tomorrow. He talks about tariffs and how that affects the oil industry. We're going to be trying to get someone online from Port of Churchill, if at all possible. There's a lot happening in the energy space, and if you think that you'd like to come online, talking to Pipeline Online podcast, get in depth about the things that are happening out there, I'd really appreciate it. So that's about it, folks. Stay on here before we log off, Chris and Bronwyn, and thank you very much. Have a good day.